So welcome back, folks, after the very short break. So I'm going to cover chapter 5, of course, today. That's what we've been talking about. The usual pattern. I'm going to first talk about situating the chapter within Mark's gospel as a whole. Then we'll bring out our top theme for the week and the style matters section, in which we talk about an aspect of Mark's style, narrative style. And then we'll also talk about one word, mark his words. Sorry about these awful puns, but they're going to be with you now for the whole session, so get used to them. And then finally, some other stuff, which is quite a bit to cover this week, so I'll bash on if I may. So looking at chapter 5, you'll now be very familiar with this table, our tripartite division of Mark's gospel into these scenes in Galilee, mostly, though obviously we've been in Gentile land, haven't we, a little bit in chapter 5. And then later on, from the middle of chapter 8 onwards, we're going to go on the way to Jerusalem, where eventually Jesus will suffer, die, and rise from the dead. And of course, then the action implicitly at least goes back to Galilee. But for now, we're still in the early stages of Galilee, and we're really talking still about the deeds of power. And particularly here, as you observed already yourselves, Jesus's power over non-human and rather scary forces that threaten human life. So they are demonic forces, long-term, highly disabling illness, which could even result potentially in death, and death itself. So Jesus takes on all of these and is victorious. And as more than one of you pointed out, I certainly remember Anne-Marie saying it, the calming of the storm actually belongs with these stories, really. So don't worry about the chapter divisions. Think of the calming of the storm as being alongside these. So you've really got 4 stories that belong together thematically. And as I said last week, we're still going on this sequence of deeds of power that's going to actually carry on right the way now until the end of the Galilee section in the middle of chapter 8. But we are seeing for the first time today moving into Gentile territory as well as Jewish. And we still do see opposition, hardly any in this chapter, still present, but rather more sporadic. Mostly misunderstanding, but we'll come to that a little bit more as we go on. So that's where we've got the chapter 5 in the relation to the gospel. My top theme for this week is the crowd. I've constantly been threatening to talk about this, and I think we finally need to just kind of have a bit of a look at it. So the crowd does feature in a number of stories in this chapter. It's referred to in different ways in Mark, by the way. The Greek word is ochlos. That actually occurs about 38 times, which is actually more in Mark. You can see this little chart over to the right. This is the Mark bar here, and there's more of it than any of the other Gospels, as you can see. But there are other words as well. So in chapter 3, it referred to a great multitude. Remembered all those people coming from different places. Happens to be in Greek polyplethos. If you hear of plethora, for example, that's where that word that comes from the Greek word. And poly, of course, is for many as well. You sometimes just hear all or many. Those words are used quite a lot, again, to refer to a crowd, or the whole city, the whole town, or from every region, it sometimes says. So all of these different words and phrases are implying the crowd, basically. And sometimes they've got no name at all, as we'll see next week in chapter 6 and also in chapter 7. Now, the crowd plays an important role in Mark, as you can see. The thing is that in the Greco-Roman world, attitudes were mostly negative. Our very phrase, the hoi polloi, is that's what it is, the many. That's what, that's the Greek word for the many. But, many authors, some of you will know the Roman poet Horace, and he said in the first line of the first ode in book 3 of his odes, I hate and avoid the common mass of people. Now, if you know Horace well, he was a bit of a, certainly a bit of a climber, let's put it that way. So he wasn't keen on the common people. But Jesus is completely different. Jesus has pity on the crowds and deals with their needs. And next week, in a scene that is deeply resonant to me as a deacon, particularly, is Jesus's love for and pity on the crowd. But that's a matter for next week's session. So that's the crowd, comes up a lot. Jesus is more positive towards it than the rest of the Greco-Roman world were. But the thing about crowds is they gather, don't they? They gather around Jesus. Maybe sometimes not genuine discipleship, but maybe rather more self-serving. So they were interested in his healing, for he had cured many, it said last week. And maybe they were curious. hearing all he was doing, it says also in chapter 3. But they're enthusiastic. They're very keen on Jesus. They are amazed. That word there that was brought up. Lorna was bringing that up just now. And they certainly do have some sense, even if it's a little bit ill-formed, that we're seeing something new in Jesus. Remember, this is a new teaching with authority. We have never seen anything like this, it said in chapter 2, verse 12. And of course, they will go on with hosannas and welcoming the coming kingdom of David, as they will do in chapter 11, before, sadly, of course, it's all going to turn the other way. And the crowd will eventually turn on Jesus. There is a crowd that comes with Judas to arrest Jesus. Maybe not exactly the same people, but a body of people. Very clear that Mark wants you to hear the same word there and think of the resonance of that in contrast to the crowds that were earlier in Jesus' career. And of course, the crowd is stirred up by the chief priests to demand Jesus' execution. Not this man, but Barabbas. Crucify him, is what the crowd eventually turns to saying in chapter 15. And the crowd, of course, they gather in numbers and especially around the sea. So we had this association, we talked about the sea last week, various places there just so far, to say nothing of the extra episodes that are going to continue to occur through the first half of the gospel. And Jesus' return in this chapter, in 5:21, when he's come back from the Gentile region of the Gadarenes, he's barely off the boat. And there's a crowd waiting for him, which is actually fascinatingly in terms extremely similar to what we encountered last week at the start of chapter 4. There was a group of people beside the sea, it says, paratentalasan in the Greek. There was a boat involved, and there's a large crowd that gathered around him. Almost the same Greek words, slightly different in terms of their grammatical form. One is here in the perfect, one in the aorist, but the same principle. So a large crowd here is an oklos, either plestos or polis, and they gathered with this same verb here. These are just two different forms of the same verb, and they were either with him or around him, basically. So very, very similar language. As we observed last week, the sea is a good place, a new place to teach and heal, to reach out to people who perhaps never went into the synagogue. Isn't that something for us today to think about? How do we get to the people who are not churched, who are not regulars? And when they come, or when we encounter them, what is my attitude? Do I think, oh, well, they're Johnny-come-latelys? Or do I welcome them? Do I love them? Do I care for them as Jesus did? Now, the crowd, of course, they want to do all sorts of things, don't they? Principally, they want to touch him, as we've got in all these different things. I'm giving you the references here so that if offline you want to go and look at the presentation again itself and look these up, and that can give you an idea. Or they want Jesus to touch them, and there's another series of references. But the problem with a crowd of people who want to touch Jesus is that it actually is quite hazardous. And we saw last week that they were worried that Jesus was going to get crushed. And they were pressing on him this week. So there's a physical kind of constraint on Jesus, not just a physical lack of space. Remember in chapter 2, they couldn't get into the house barely, or nobody else could, because of so many people crowding around. He got no privacy at the end of chapter 1. He had to go out of town into the lonely places. And in chapter 3 last week, he didn't even have time to eat. So it's not easy being subject to the crowd. And he sometimes needs to keep his distance, as he did last week, by getting the boat out. And sometimes he does need to leave the crowd behind. Here's a series of references. We don't have time to go through them all. Most of them, as you can see, are still to come. So I wanted to kind of alert you to these so that you're ready to see them when they happen. But we did see one of them last week. And we do see this week that they follow him anyway. So no sooner has he got back off the boat, but they're ready there and waiting for him. Ironically, despite those hazards, the crowd actually does provide protection for Jesus, but it's only temporary, because the fear of the crowd actually dissuades the chief priests and the Pharisees and scribes from arresting him. And so we can see that particularly in chapters 11 and 12, as things really begin to hot up. You'll see that the crowd in the short term is a protection until the religious elite learn how to harness the crowd for their own purposes. So that's a little bit about the crowd. Very kind of ill-formed, very lacking, but with some understanding. And that's really, again, a challenge for us in evangelization terms today. The crowd is still out there for us to bring to Jesus. So how are we going to do that? Now, the crowd, though, I think particularly in this scene of the woman with the healing, this wonderful painting of Tisso's, by the way, you might see a few of these as I'm kind of bringing them through. Tissot did a whole series of paintings on Jesus's ministry. And here is the one of the woman with blood. And this picture appears to be in these dimensions, very tall and thin. But you can see the kind of pressing in the crowd. And the woman here is, desperately trying to actually touch him. And let me just see if I can kind of highlight that for you so you can see. Here she is, just around here, and there she is trying to touch Jesus. So there we have a really desperate situation. But curiously, it's sort of facilitated by the crowd. So the crowd had already gathered, as we said, when Jesus had got out the boat. The crowd follows him to Jairus' house, and here they are en route. But actually, the crowd provides cover for the woman. It's interesting, this, because before I've in my early days of studying Mark's gospel, I thought, well, it's actually the woman shoving through. And those of you who remember that we did this scene in the Song of Mark in Winchester, the woman had to shove through the crowd to get to Jesus. But actually, there's another element of this, is it provides cover for the woman, because she wasn't supposed to be there at all, remember, because she is violating the purity laws by even being among a crowd, because she was not supposed to touch anybody. But she can touch him and escape without being noticed, or that was what she was hoping. But Jesus has other thoughts. And as you both pointed out, the disciples say, what do you mean somebody touched you? You're in a big crowd. Not very respectful to Jesus. And Matthew and Luke don't include that element, interestingly enough. Now, when Jesus then travels on to Jairus' house, the crowd has not finished, because he dismisses one crowd. He says, you go away, and I'm now going to go on with just these people to Jairus' house. But when he arrives at Jairus' house, he finds an even bigger crowd of mourners making an absolute din. So it's a bit of an irony there that he dismisses one crowd only for it to be replaced with another. So anyway, a very quick and rapid step through the crowd, but a particular focus on how it's actually it's almost a character in its own right in this chapter 5. Let's talk about our Style Matters section. And I'm going to go back to Markan Sandwiches again this week, because this is, I think, the quintessential example of the Markan sandwich. I think it's an absolutely wonderful example of showing what Mark's about in this particular technique. So it's Jairus' daughter and a woman with bleeding. Intercalation is the posh term, inserting one story in the middle of another. So we know that Jesus arrives in the boat, the crowd gathers, Jairus comes to Jesus, and off they go towards Jairus' house to hopefully heal his daughter. But on the way, there's a crowd, the woman touches Jesus. Jesus says, who touched me? He has the encounter with the woman and says, your faith has healed you, go in peace. And they're still en route to Jairus, a bit delayed by that particular instance. And now people say, oh, don't worry about it, Jairus' daughter's already dead, don't bother the teacher. Jesus says, don't worry, you believe, Jairus. And they go on, and Jesus obviously raises the girl from death. So that's the basics of the sandwich there. We've got the meat, if you like, in the middle, and the bread on the outside. You'll remember that when we previously looked at Markan sandwiches, I talked about, well, why does Mark use this technique? I think there's two reasons. One's a narrative reason and the other's a thematic reason. So the narrative reason is a pure time delay. It allows one action to complete. So we have one segment here, and then we have another segment that goes on in narrative time, which delays a little bit of time until we can resume the first segment. It allows something to have happened in the intervening time. In this case, that something is Jesus to set off towards Jairus' house, for him to arrive apparently too late because the child has already died. That is very important, because it removes any possibility that the child is still alive, because the place is crawling with mourners. So the child, now that time delay has allowed this to be a resuscitation from death rather than just a healing. But it also, looking back on it, creates an interesting thing of Jesus being, if you like, delayed. Somebody, I think, in our group was talking about this idea that Jesus was, en route to doing a job, but actually gets delayed by this woman. That's a great moral in its own right, particularly for those of us in ordained ministry. but actually for anybody who is in a ministry of service in the church, which is all of us. How often does somebody come to us at an inconvenient time? Our challenge is to see the need and try and deal with that as best we can in the middle of doing the other things that we're doing. Certainly a lesson for me, I know. Now, that's the narrative side of things, but the thematic element of it allows us to show the meaning of one story by means of another, so that we have some themes coming up in one story that are either compared or contrasted. Let's have a look at that in a bit more detail. So here, I'm going to bring up nine things that are common between the stories. Both are about women. Women, remember them? So remember, women were not greatly, they didn't have much status in this society. They're both in absolutely dire situations where they can no longer be helped. Makes clear, all the physicians who tried to help, the girl is dead. There is hope, though, that they can be saved. The word for healing and the word for saving, the Greek sozo, is exactly the same verb. And that Mark plays on that dual meaning in this scene. There are both, Jairus falls down before Jesus, the woman falls down before Jesus. Both these women are in a situation where the issues of being married and bearing children are at odds. If this woman had a bleeding, she was probably either never got married, or if she had been married, might have been divorced, because she couldn't bear children, and that was an excuse for somebody to divorce her. So she's on her own. She can't fulfill, if you like, the what society expected of her. And the girl is 12 years old, just at the age when she would soon be able to be betrothed. I know that's frighteningly early for our society, but that's why 12 is significant, because by 13 and 14, she could already be married and on the way to bearing children. So both of these women are at the stage where they cannot fulfill that societal destiny for them. In both cases, the word daughter appears. Jairus asks for his daughter to be healed. Jesus addresses the woman as daughter. The number 12, the significance of the woman having been in this situation for 12 years, and the girl 12 years and not quite being able to get any further because she's died. Uncleanness, as I think Lorna was pointing out, is a very important element here, that both women were causing a situation of ritual uncleanness. And I'm going to talk about that in a bit more detail in a second. And in both scenes, there is a misunderstanding by observers of what Jesus can and can't do, followed by a dramatic manifestation of what Jesus can do. So with all of these together, the real common element, I think, is that the comparison is really leading us to the issue of faith, the importance of faith. That Jairus is told to have faith. The woman's faith has allowed her to be healed. Why is faith important in these scenes specifically? I think because it allows them to conquer fear. They go through obstacles in order to get to Jesus and get him to work his greatness. It's all about really not magic, as Lorna was saying, not magic, but it's about the person and power of Jesus. And this will be contrasted in chapter 6, which we won't talk about too much now, but just wanted to alert you to it, that it will be contrasted with the unbelief that happens when he goes back to Nazareth, and is so significant that he can work no deeds of power. So there you go. This comparison in the sandwich allows us to really focus on the commonality, and therefore really helps us to emphasize what the key theme of both of the stories are, by them each reflecting on each other. Let's talk about Mark's word for the week. I said it was going to be fear. That Greek word is phobos, and that's the most common Markan word for fear. That occurs 14 times in various forms, but there are also a couple of other words. They only occur once each. One's called delos, which is cowardly, which is the one that we have in the calming of the storm. Why are you afraid? Why are you bottling it, if you like? Why are you cowardly? And later on in the walking on the water, we'll have the verb tarasso, which is literally stir or shake or stir. Why are you shaken? There is also amazement, which is, I think, such an important group of words that I'll have to take it on a different week. But fear and amazement are clearly highly related to each other. And there's also implicit fear. Even if the word fear is not mentioned, we see implicit fear. Many of you observed what a strange story the first one is, particularly. And of course, it looks like it was at night, which makes it even more scary. Do the disciples even get out of the boat, by the way? We don't really know. But verse 2 of chapter 5 says, when Jesus stepped out of the boat, there was the demoniac ready for him. It didn't really say what the disciples did or didn't do. Now, there are two types, I think, two ways in which fear is expressed in Mark's gospel. One is, if you like, an after the event fear. It's reacting to the mighty deeds of Jesus. And so I'm not going to go through these in detail, but last week we saw Jesus rebuking the disciples for their fear, for their delos, in this case, in the calming of the storm. And in this week, we're also seeing the local people, seeing the result of Jesus' healing, they have great fear. So they're the ones that we've had so far. The rest of these episodes, I'm just going to mention. I'm not going to go through them in detail. You can look them up for yourselves if you want to have time, but get ready for next week, for example, also in chapter 9, and of course at the empty tomb in chapter 16. All of these are occurrences of fear, after the event fear. In other words, fear related to something that Jesus has already done. But the other type of fear is fear of what might happen. So fear before, in anticipation. And there's two types of this fear. One is fear of the consequences, fear to do something because you're worried about what might happen. And so the woman with bleeding approaches Jesus with fear and trembling, strangely reminiscent of the apostles' phrase in the first letter to the Corinthians. But I think that's probably more of a coincidence than anything, but fear and trembling. And Jesus says to Jairus, don't fear, keep on believing. So fear and belief are set alongside each other, which is something we're going to come to in a bit more detail in just a second. And then there's a series of other episodes here where the disciples are afraid because Jesus is talking about his passion and what's going to happen to him. But I just wanted to tee those up for you if you want to look at them in advance. Otherwise, just know that they have been mentioned. And fear of somebody else is the other type of fear. So this is more like political or religious fear. So mainly it's by the chief priests who are afraid of the crowd, as I mentioned before, but there's also Herod's fear of John the Baptist. So again, not going to go through those in detail. I just wanted you to see that they were there so that when we encounter them in future weeks, you're already alerted to that and happening. And there's another one, in Mark chapter 12. So fear before, fear after. But not just a case of what fear is in time, whether it's before the event or after the event. What type of fear? I think there are two types of fear in Mark. There's the sort of fear that is debilitating and paralyzing. It's stopping you doing something. And that's generally because people don't have the proper understanding or they don't have enough faith. And so terror takes over. So that happens with the Gerasenes, for example, doesn't it? When they see the healed demoniac, they're terrified of what's happened. But I think there is another type of fear, which was observed by a theologian a German theologian called Ott. He talked about the numinous, the holy, the awe, if you like. The fear of the Lord is holy, abiding forever, it says in the Psalms. And that phrase, fear of the Lord, Phobos Kuriou, occurs 78 times in the Hebrew scriptures, or particularly in the Greek, 78 times in the Septuagint, the Greek version of the Hebrew scriptures. So the fear of the Lord can be a reason to be feared. And maybe that's something of what the woman with bleeding is experiencing when she goes back to Jesus. Not that just she's worried about being told off, but that she knows there is something special going on here. And perhaps that's what's happening with the women at the empty tomb, but we've got several chapters to go before we need to talk about that. So I think there is something here of people acting in faith even when they are afraid. In other words, a bit like that wonderful homily of Father Mark's last week. Anyway, as Mother Teresa says, people are afraid but act anyway. And I think that's what the woman with bleeding did. She had fear and trembling, but she still went ahead and came forward and told Jesus the whole truth. And Jesus to Jairus, don't fear, just keep on believing. So the question for us is, do we allow fear to overwhelm us so much that it stops us from acting, from having faith, from going with what the Lord is doing? let's talk very quickly then about a few other ideas in the remaining minutes I've got. So first one I want to talk about is the stronger one. I think I've been threatening to talk about this for a few weeks. This is, by the way, isn't this a wonderful picture of Jesus in majesty? This is actually from the Basilica of the Immaculate Conception in Washington, D.C. I've never been there before, but perhaps some of you have. Wonderful mosaic of Jesus being very powerful, I think is very clear there. Now, all the situations in chapter 5 are actually beyond human help. I think Anne-Marie was saying they're all dire situations. Nobody had the strength to subdue the demoniac, it says in verses 3 and 4. The physicians couldn't cure the woman's bleeding. And the messengers and the mourners said, there's nothing can be done now, the girl's dead. They all looked hopeless. They were hopeless, except for what the stronger one can do. Why is he the stronger one? Well, remember that John the Baptist said in chapter 1, one who is more powerful is coming after me. But Jesus, I think, really alludes to it when he talks in chapter 3, that little parable about, well, you can't enter a strong man's house unless you first bind up the strong man, and then you can plunder his property. Well, the strong man there is Satan, and here is Jesus being the stronger one. And he's about to tie Satan up and take away his property. In this case, the demoniac. There's no longer under the control of satanic, demonic powers, but now back with Jesus and wanting to follow Jesus. So Jesus shows that power and authority over the powers of darkness. Even, as some of you pointed out, going back to chapter 4, that's the calming of the storm. He rebukes the winds and the waves, and they obey him. And he overcomes the strength of legion. We were talking in our session, in our group, about the Good News translation talked about a mob. Well, that doesn't really do justice to legion. When you hear legion, or certainly when Mark's audience hear legion, you can't get away from that Roman term. 6,000 soldiers, Roman occupation, all the power. But Jesus can overcome even that strength. And of course, the power went out of him when the woman touched his garment. So Jesus is powerful, and he has power even to deal with situations that look hopeless. And of course, he tells the girl, just get up. And what does she do? She gets up immediately. Remember lots of those little doublets that we were talking about in the earlier sessions in Mark's Gospel? Something is said and something immediately happens. When Jesus says it, it always happens. I think it was Lorna was talking about unclean, so I've decided to take that on this week because we can't really avoid it, can we? Jesus encounters different forms of ritual impurity. So the demoniac, because he lives among tombs, is unclean. I mean, setting aside the fact that he's a Gentile as well, but he lives in an area where pigs are farmed and eaten because he's a Gentile, and that's another source of uncleanness. And he cuts himself. Mark's audience would have gone, yes, certainly if they had any Jewish background, they'd have remembered that in the book of the Kings, the the prophets of Baal are kind of cutting themselves to try and kind of get Baal to come, and Elijah's having a good laugh at them, basically. So lots of different signs there that we're in unclean territory. The woman with bleeding, of course, has a flow of blood. It says that's what literally the Greek says. That recalls the language of the book of Leviticus, again in the Greek, in the Septuagint, in chapter 12 and chapter 15. It talks specifically about how that flow of blood would have prevented her touching anyone or any holy thing. Well, she touches a holy thing, all right, doesn't she? She touches the Holy One of God. But more of that in a second. Jairus' daughter, she's dead, and therefore she's a corpse. And anyone who touches a corpse is unclean. That's what it says in the book of Numbers. You can look up these references in your own time, should you wish. As somebody pointed out, Jesus goes beyond the laws, though. That's what the laws and social conventions said. That's what was about what was clean and unclean. But Jesus, he deals with everybody. Lepers, tax collectors, the Sabbath, as well as the demoniac and the woman with bleeding and the dead girl in this episode. Jesus is always looking to go beyond those conventions and those laws, as we will see in much more detail in chapter 7. But I'm not going to say no more about that for the time being. But just remember I did say it, though, when we come up to that. Jesus is really about liberation for everybody, whatever their situation. Let's take on secrecy. It keeps coming back, doesn't it? I think here we are seeing in chapter 5 a continued tension between what is hidden and what needs to be revealed. We talked about that a lot last week, didn't we, in the parables of chapter 4? But we can't get away from the fact that Jesus actually gives different instructions to people in this chapter about what they're going to do. But the circumstances are different. And that, I think, is key to this. The demoniac is asked to proclaim, caruso, that verb about proclamation. But he's a Gentile, and he's going to Gentiles. He asks him to proclaim to his friends and family what the Lord has done. So he is now on mission to the Gentiles, where there would be less issue about who the Messiah is, who the King of the Jews is, etc., etc. The woman with bleeding, she was the one who wanted to keep the secret. She wanted to just touch him, be healed, and go away. But Jesus stops her and brings that healing into the open quite deliberately. And why? Somebody pointed this out to point out that this wasn't a question of magic, but of faith and of the healing power of Jesus coming from God himself. Jairus' family, most puzzlingly perhaps, are ordered to tell no one. Why? I don't know is the honest answer. Maybe it was in the short term, just simply for the girl's sake. But also Jesus generally wants to avoid sensationalism, doesn't he? He doesn't want this idea of just this crowd idea of, oh, Jesus is the miracle worker. He's so much more than that. But there is also, and this is wants to return to something that we talked about last week and the week before, this outside versus inside theme. Jesus pushes them all outside. Ekbalo is the Greek verb there. Shoves them out, except those who are with him. Remember what the 12 were there? They were there to be with him and those around him when we talked about chapter 3. So that distinction is a very important one. And I think we can look at Jairus's, the healing of Jairus' daughter, as a secret, but a witnessed secret. It's got a limited witness, but it's got a witness. And we can see that same withdrawal from the crowd to push everybody else away and do things in a more intimate environment, also in 2 other healings that we're going to come up to in the next few chapters as well. The same thing happens, not unique to Jesus. Same thing happens with Elijah and Elisha in the book of the Kings, first book of the Kings and the second book of the Kings, respectively, where each of them raises somebody from the dead. So it's not unique to Jesus. And I think the issue is, do you understand what's going on? Are you able to put it into a context? Where are we going with regard to Jesus's ultimate destiny as the Son of God, who is going to take on and defeat the powers of Satan? And in any case, miracles, even when they're witnessed, don't settle arguments, do they? We're going to see next week how Jesus is treated in Nazareth, despite all of these deeds of power that we've just had. Immediately, Jesus is put into a situation where everybody's really very skeptical about him anyway. So, it's not really just a matter of secrecy. It's a matter of, do you get it or do you not? Is your heart hardened or is it not? Let's talk briefly about mourners, because there was an element to this which you might not have got. So it wasn't just people being genuinely sad for the death of a young child. Elaborate rituals of mourning are widely attested in the Jewish and Hellenistic world, and in fact are still common in the Middle East today, both in Israel and in surrounding areas. But there was they like to do it loud, basically. They like to weep and wail loudly, which is what Mark's alluding to. In the parallel passage in Matthew, he even mentions flute players. Here's our flute player. I don't know why flute players are important. Arthur, please note, you might be able to get a job there as a funeral player. Because, and this is the bit you may not know, professional mourners are likely to have been there. Professional mourners. They do exist now, evidently. Professional mourners were there, especially women who have evidently recruited for this role, even for somebody who's poor. And you can see that alluded to in the prophet Jeremiah, if you want to go and look that up. Now, if there are professional mourners on site and Jesus says the child's not dead, I think we do have to think, I think the professional mourners are going to get a bit annoyed. They were hoping to make a nice bit of earning here, and Jesus has just messed it all up. Jesus, you see, is challenging economic gain here. I think that's what's happening with the pigs as well, by the way. I think some people are annoyed at Jesus because he doesn't suit them economically. And we see the superficiality of the grief when their tears, their loud wailing, changes to laughter when Jesus says the child's not dead, but just sleeping. Because bodies decompose very rapidly in the Middle East, mourners had to be assembled really immediately after a death. And the interesting thing here is that they had gathered at Jairus' house even before Jairus had been told what had happened. So they were straight on the job, if you like. So I think there's some interesting context there that give you an idea as to why there's actually a particularly, bad treatment of Jesus in this particular thing, and why he wants to cast people out. Because we had a bunch of people here who certainly weren't ready for what Jesus was trying to show them. Let's have a quick look then, finally, at just a couple of elements of Markan detail. There is just so many of these. We did mention this one in the first session, but I've just going to have a little bit more detail to look at it. Again, don't get worried about the detail. Here's Mark in the middle, Matthew on the left, and Luke on the right. You can see immediately that Mark is the longer story. There's gaps in the Lucan one, but there's no gaps at all in Mark. But there's also all this detail in yellow that's changed or summarized by Luke or Matthew, but also the blue, which is absolutely unique to Mark. And what are they? Well, something about the power of the demon. He was howling and bruising himself with stones. There's a dialogue here between the demon or the legion and Jesus, quite an extensive dialogue, actually. And then there's the amazement of the people of the Decapolis when this healed man goes about telling his story. Luke doesn't like all that stuff and actually doesn't find Mark a very good storyteller, so Luke feels the need to improve on him. And Luke has his own reasons for doing that, which we might come to another day if we ever get to talk about Luke. But there you are, a little bit of an idea of this specific story, how the Markan detail plays out. But I also want to talk about Markan detail in relation to the Jairus and woman with bleeding story, because I think I want to show you why detail matters in Mark. Not just that it's a series of random bits of detail, but here the detail matters because I think it raises three very specific points. One is that what really characterizes this story, and some of you have pointed this out in our discussion, is this very personal encounter between the woman and Jesus. And so in order to establish that, Mark needs to give us some detail about the woman's predicament. So he tells her that her bleeding had not only not been healed, but had actually got worse, and that the woman felt in herself that she'd been healed. It's beautiful how we see this story from the woman's perspective. Very countercultural, really, at the time. Remember, women didn't have much status. Jesus as well, we see as a real participant in the story. He felt the power going out from him. And then he turned round and looked to see who had done it. All this is, remember, this is all detail that's in Mark only. And the reason I think he's doing it is to stress this element of the personal engagement between these two individuals, the woman and Jesus. But he also mentions detail in order to clarify the significance of what's going on. So that Jesus says to the woman, not only go in peace, but be healed, be continued to be healed. It's in a present tense, which implies some sort of continuous state going on. And he also says to the mourners, why do you make a commotion? Because the child is not dead, but asleep. Again, getting ready to highlight to us that for Jesus, that this situation that appears hopeless can actually be retrieved. And then there are elements that are just there, I think, to make the statement vivid. The disciples retort to Jesus, what do you mean? You're in a crowd. You say somebody's touched you? Matthew and Luke found that far too disrespectful and left it out altogether. The command in Aramaic, which is not a piece of magic, and Mark wants to make that entirely clear. He does want you to hear what Jesus said, because that beautiful little phrase, Talitha kum, little lamb, get up. And the girl walked about because she was 12 years old, said Mark. And so that lovely little bit of detail there as well. So that just shows how Mark kind of fits in detail, but he uses it for very specific reasons as well. And one final point. I've gone on a couple of times about historic present, and I just wanted to show you how this actually features in the story of Jairus' daughter. So here's the story of Jairus' daughter. I've left a space here, which is this space here in the middle would be where the incident of the woman, whoops, not very good at drawing there, but that's in that middle space here is where the woman with the bleeding would have happened. So you've got that kind of first, you've got the first kind of, you've got the first part of the Jairus episode and the second one here. And the thing I'm trying to show you is the blue bits, basically. So you can see here these little time things around the blue. I hope you can see enough of them. The red, by the way, is Jesus talking. But all I want you to see is there's lots of blue. And the blue is because of this thing called historic present. And this is where Mark uses the present tense, even though he's describing events that are in the past. So it said, then came one of the rulers of the synagogue. That's what the translation says. But actually in the Greek, that is, then one of the rulers of the synagogue comes. He falls at his feet and he implores Jesus earnestly. So all of this is in the present tense in the Greek. But we don't see that in most English translations because it would be rather tiresome. I think Nick King has a little bit of it, but I think even he doesn't kind of reflect every single one. But it's a very specific thing about Mark. It does occur in other Greco-Roman literature as well. See it a fair bit in the Iliad and the Odyssey on occasions. Why? Well, because I think it's just more vivid. By the way, it's much more densely used, curiously, in the second part of the story than the first. And I think that gives us a clue as to why. You see, I think historic present, he sees this, he does this. Sometimes young people will describe stories like that. Have you ever heard a son or a daughter or a grandchild say, well, then I say this, and then he was like, he's like that, and etc. So sometimes they can go to present tense to just make the story more immediate. Gives you a kind of you are there feel. Anyway, just an interesting aspect of Markan style. I just wanted you to see the blue signs because, as I say, you won't see it in the average English translation. Good. Apologies for having run over. As you can see, there's 101 other things I could have talked about. If you're interested in any of those, take a look at the presentation offline, and you can always ask me about it another week. But now let's have some questions.
Right, here we go. So why did Jesus want to know the name of the evil spirit? Is it that important?
Yes, in the culture of the time, knowing the name of a demon was to have, or knowing the name of any spirit was to have control over it. And so knowing the name is important. That's why, curiously, the demons might be naming Jesus as the Son of the Most High, not to acknowledge him as God, but to, in a vain attempt to try and get some power over him. So that's really what's going on there. That's a kind of culture-specific thing. I think also it has a narrative significance as well, though, because obviously in this case we want to hear that image of the legion.
So why did the man possessed beg that Jesus would not send them the legion out of the country?
So remember, we have to think that it's not the man speaking here, but the legion itself. So the bunch of spirits, the large number of spirits. So it's the spirits who are asked to be sent out. I covered this in my own group. There is a curious thing that demons in the kind of world of the time, the ancient Middle East world, tended to like to be local. They liked to stay where they were. I rather jokingly said maybe their kids were still at primary school or something, I don't know, or whatever. But anyway, they like to stay local. If you have a look at Luke chapter 11, and by the way, group one, my memory's not as bad as I thought. It was Luke chapter 11. There's a lovely little story about Jesus talking about a demon that, having been expelled from one place, wanders around the district trying to find somewhere else to get in. That has quite significance for you, the way in which Jesus is trying to get the demons under control.
Right, so why does Jesus send the legion demons from one man into 2,000 pigs and not just one pig?
Because there were 6,000 of them if they were legion. Remember, legion is 6,000 soldiers. So there was a very, even so, there was a greater than 1-to-1 demon to pig ratio going on here. Even if it was 2,000 pigs, and they were getting 4 demons each at least. So, and that's only if you average it out. I don't know how Jesus arranged it. But sorry, not to be flippant for a second. The importance of it is that they had to go somewhere. And as I was pointing out, while it seems to our ears rather cruel, remember this is a situation in their world in which they wouldn't have worried. They would have worried less about pigs than we do. And this is a world which is largely Jewish, and so pigs don't really matter anyway. So we might not agree with that, but that's the world. But the most important point is, if Luke's right in chapter 11 and those demons have got to go somewhere, if they don't go into the pigs, then where are they going? If they're going to go roaming about, they could cause an awful lot more difficulty and they'd be out of control. So that's possibly part of the story. But the answer is we don't really know. This is one of the mysterious elements of this story. I can't claim to have all the answers. I can just give you some things that might be worth thinking about. But I certainly can't complain. I can't claim to fully understand this story.
So why did Jesus send the evil spirit to another living creature? Wasn't there any alternatives?
Well, again, in the story, no. Remember, it was a relatively deserted region. So they were in the tombs, in the rocks. If anybody's been to that area, it's a pretty wild area, I gather. Again, I've not been myself, but certainly seen some film of how that looks. Again, in the story, that was the alternative. That's as best that I can answer.
Okay. So last part of this. So why did the demons once in the pigs throw themselves to their deaths, but did not do so when in the man?
Well, again,
Don't blame me. Blame the questioners.
The answer is I don't know. I mean, you could just got to go with what the story says. You could argue that perhaps it had some pretty dire effects on the man, but perhaps in poor pigs, all they knew what to do was to run down the hill, and they maybe I don't even know whether they knew they were going to get drowned or not. They were just running in panic, perhaps. The problem is, we can't enter into pig psychology here, really. We're getting way beyond the bounds of the story, really. It's just what happened. We've got to retain an element in this story. It's got to stay strange. It's a really weird story. We don't have a complete grip on it. This is a society 2,000 years before us, 21st century mind and the first century Middle Eastern mind. We've got to acknowledge that there's a difference between those two worlds. Right.
Okay. So extremely conscious of time. So this is the last one I'm going to pose in this group, this session.
Yeah, I think so.
Why did Jesus?
Sorry, we'll take more on. If you do want to stay and talk about Jairus, and we'll try and focus on Jairus in the 10 minutes afterwards. Sorry, Jared, off you go.
So why did Jesus tell the demonic to go and tell his friends, but to the family of the little girl to tell no one?
So I think I covered this in the presentation. So hopefully I'm not going to spend too much time on it. You can go back and have a listen to the presentation. But fundamentally, we're talking about two different audiences. One is Jewish, one is Gentile. We're talking about two different situations where, there's the pressure of being the Messiah or viewed as one, and the Gentile territory where that's safe. We're talking about a man who can safely go and evangelize, if you like, to his local community, because Jesus is not going to be there. So he needs the man to do the job for him. But there's this constant pressure all the way around these secrecy stories. Does anybody really understand who Jesus is? Nobody does until chapter 16. He is not here. He is risen. That, I think, will have to be the last question for now. Please do stay if you can, if you want to talk a bit more about Jairus and the woman. But I think what we're going to do is we're going to say a prayer, have a blessing, and some of you can go, should you wish to, and some of you can stay and talk about Jairus and the woman as well.